Welcome to the Foreign Policy Week in Review with Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Before I talk to Daniel directly, I want to play a 7-minute clip of an interview Daniel did last week with RT, in which he discussed the fact that sanctions against countries not only do not work, but in fact oftentimes boomerang against the very countries that employ them. Listen now to what Daniel McAdams had to say this past week on RT.
Well, for more analysis on Russia-US relations, we can speak live now to Daniel McAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Peace Institute. If you can hear me, Daniel, President Obama recently cautioned that the policy of sanctions might not actually be as effective as they'd first been hoping. Let's just take a quick listen to what Obama had to say, first of all.
Ratchet up sanctions further and further and further, and then ultimately Putin changes his mind, I think, is a miscalculation.
So that's what Obama had to say. We can see you now, by the way. We've got the line sorted out. So him saying that, you know, this isn't something they can just keep on doing and force Putin into behaving how they want him to. And yet, what do we see next? A bill signed that authorises yet more restrictions, should they want them, against Moscow. What kind of message is this sending?
Well, I think it's interesting. Just yesterday, when the president announced a major change in policy toward Cuba, he said that 50 years of sanctions hasn't worked. It doesn't work. Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is counterproductive. So he recognizes that this doesn't work. You know, the most important thing about this bill, I think, there are two things. First of all, what this essentially is a placeholder authorization of an enormous amount of money, not just for military aid, but money to increase U.S. propaganda broadcasts into the region. What it is similar to is the 2002 authorization for war against Iraq, where Congress said, here's the authorization, use it if you need to, whenever you need to, no need to contact us, here you go. And that's essentially what Congress is doing. It's giving the president this authorization. The second part that's most important is the way this bill was passed. This was brought up at night after all other members went home. It was 3 members of Congress who colluded to bring this up after everyone was gone. It was Ed Royce, the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel, who is also on the committee, and Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, who was the co-chair of the House Ukrainian Caucus. The bill was brought up and passed within a minute's time. There was nobody there to object. The only statement that Marcy Kaptur said was that Russia had invaded Ukraine, and this is a response. Well, bills like this are generally written by the special interests. So my guess is there was some Ukrainian special interest group that passed this through the Ukraine caucus to Marcy Kaptur, and it went up the flag to Ed Royce, the chairman of the committee. So this is all a very underhanded and nefarious way of passing a very, very significant escalation bill.
Let's turn to the Russian ruble now, because that's what has a lot of people in Russia concerned, the Russian public. President Putin himself admitted that sanctions, to a smaller extent, but they had an effect upon, for example, the ruble crashing. Do you think that this bill could have an effect, if it's used, upon the value of the ruble?
Well, I think this is a pincher movement that the U.S. and its allies are using against Russia. The U.S., it's well known from many news reports, has been colluding with Saudi Arabia to reduce the price of oil significantly, which certainly has hurt Russia's bottom line. When you combine that with sanctions that restrict the ability of Russia to raise currency on international markets, you have a pincher move. I would almost call it a nuclear first strike option against the Russian economy. You know, the U.S. is turning a blind eye to the repercussions, you know, a retaliatory strike, or you'd call it unintended consequences against its own economy. It seems like they're going for broke, trying to take down the Russian economy. Who knows what kinds of resources they'll apply to this, I believe, foolhardy attempt.
Now, this next point I want to move on to, for me, is quite confusing, because you hear about all the condemnation, the allegations that Russia was somehow supplying arms to the rebels in Ukraine, but this bill also authorises lethal aid to be supplied by the US to Ukraine. If that happens, what effect could US arms have on the crisis in the East, do you think?
Well, the bill does not only authorize $350 million worth of arms, which, by the way, is a huge Christmas gift to the U.S. defense contractors, but it also sets forth U.S. policy, which is that Kiev should attempt to get back the territories in eastern Ukraine, essentially giving them a green light for an attack. So that is an enormously significant development on that front.
Washington has said many times that it's open for dialogue, yet if you look at this bill, more punitive measures, more sanctions, weaponry for Ukraine, that doesn't really seem to add up. What do you make of that contradiction?
Well, this is called coercive diplomacy. Dialogue presupposes that you accept the dictate of the other partner. This is what the U.S. has been doing with Iran for the past year or so. So it has the appearance of diplomatic talks, but in reality, the other partner has to concede major points, has to give up its position before the U.S. will engage in a dialogue. Coercive diplomacy does not have a very good track record.
Looking forward, Daniel, where do you see this going from here? Do you think the US is just going to keep on battering away with more and more sanctions, or take a different direction?
Well, I think people should understand how limited the information inputs are to members of Congress. You know, I served a member of Congress for 12 years, and I know that other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I know what information inputs they have. It's exclusively newspapers like the Washington Post, like the Wall Street Journal, who are absolutely one-sided in their propaganda. I mean, these papers are more lockstep than Pravda would have been in the height of the Soviet Union. So their inputs are only one sort, and these people absolutely dominate the discussion in Washington right now. The handful of members of Congress who are somewhat uneasy can easily be ignored, and that's what's happening. So it's very, very dangerous, and it reminds us of what happened 100 years ago when there was arrogance and ignorance combining to lead to a horrible conflagration. And I fear if something radical doesn't change quickly, that's exactly where we're headed.
Very interesting to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for coming on to speak to us. That's Daniel McAdams, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Peace Institute. Thanks so much.
Well, there you just heard Daniel McAdams speaking on RT last week in an interview he did this past Thursday. We're fortunate to have Daniel with us now, so welcome, Daniel.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to be back with you.
Always good to have you here. You know, Daniel, we just finished listening to your interview on RT, and as you noted, President Obama himself acknowledged that sanctions don't work very well, if at all. They have certainly not worked in Cuba for over 30 years. And I do want to get to hear what you have to say about sanctions that he is, about opening up with Cuba, as the President announced this week. But before we get to that, I'd like you to comment a bit more about additional sanctions passed against Russia. You know, despite the fact that the President says they don't work, he's signed into law a bill that will allow him to impose more sanctions in Russia in a bill, the so-called Ukrainian Freedom Support Act of 2014. So this bill not only passed through Congress this past week, but it passed in a very sneaky manner, as I understand it. Could you first comment on the bill itself, and what does it do? What does this bill seek to do to Russia, and then perhaps explain how it was passed without any kind of fair hearing in Congress?
Well, you know, you're right. It's funny because, and it's ironic because the day before the president signed this bill, he made this dramatic announcement that the U.S. would have a significant policy shift toward Cuba, and he made the point, which I think is exactly correct, which is that it's foolish to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. But, you know, this president always seems to be able to craft nice-sounding words and then never follows it up with a logical action, you know, based on those words. Mm-hmm. So, you know, without any sense of irony, the next day he signs a bill that authorizes him to impose yet more sanctions against the Russian private business and the Russian economy.
Yeah.
And these are particularly, and it's certainly not a coincidence, these sanctions will be particularly targeting the defense, military sector and the energy sector, which are the two areas that the U.S. is targeting for political reasons. Mm-hmm. And not to get too much into the trees of the the sanctions bill. But what is quite interesting is, if you look at the sanctions on the Russian arms producers, they are, if I remember correctly, every single aspect of those sanctions refer to Russia selling weapons to Syria. So any company that sells weapons to Syria is to be sanctioned by the U.S. And it really is. It smacks of hypocrisy because none of us love the global arms market, of which the U.S. by the way is the hands down largest supplier, the largest dealer in arms and in death in the world. We don't love that, Jay, but the fact of the matter is Russia has sold weapons to the legitimate government of Syria, whereas the United States has given weapons to these various rebel groups where they end up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So, if we don't like arms being sold, that's fine, that's one thing, but there certainly is a difference between selling them over the on the table to a legitimate government and giving them under the table to terrorists and psychopaths.
Right. Right. Well, Daniel, it seems to me that a lot of the Russian military, or let's say industrial base, is in sort of the eastern Ukraine too. Is that part of the target, perhaps?
Well, they certainly, Russia had done a lot of business in terms of its military supplies with factories in eastern Ukraine, and that's essentially been cut off because those factories are no longer functioning. I would guess you're probably right that the U.S. is hoping that those do not start cranking back up to the benefit of Russia. It's not explicitly stated in the piece of legislation, but you're right. I wouldn't be surprised if that was not at least the intention, a part of it.
Well, Daniel, I can't help but think, as you were talking about trying to tie down anybody who would support Russia with anything that would allow it to export more arms. I did see a clip on Bloomberg this last week. The Bloomberg television has these constant news headlines, and it talked about how Russia has increased its weapons sales, its weapons exports, running counter to a trend, it said, counter to a global trend, implying that the United States isn't doing anything like that, or we're backing away from it. But the Russians are always the bad guys here, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Well, speaking of global weapons sales, the other interesting thing in this legislation that the president signed on Friday is that it authorizes $350 million to be given to Ukraine for the purchase of lethal military supplies. But if you look at the next sentence after that, it's quite interesting. It says this money will be spent on U.S. manufacturers of these supplies. So what this really is a lot of corporate welfare too.
Sure.
And as I said, I think in another place, it's a huge Christmas present to all of the U.S. arms merchants.
It's the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about, and it's getting bigger and bigger. It seems to me. When you look at it, it's just incredible. Well, to what extent do you think that pushing this bill, Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, I think is a joke. All these bills that are passed have names in them. The bills are named a lot of times under exactly the opposite of what they're intended to do. But the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, to what extent do you think this might be pushing us closer to a direct confrontation with Russia?
Well, you make a great point, Jay, in that the title itself is ominous. It's if you remember back in 1998, the bill that was passed the bill that was signed into law at that time was some variation on the theme of the Iraq Freedom Support Act, and we all know where that led. And I'm sure you remember that Ron Paul said at the time on the House floor that passage of this bill, this is back in '98, passage of this bill is going to lead to another war with Iraq. And of course, everyone said he was nuts. This bill is designed to prevent war. That's why we have to give them their freedom so we can prevent war.
Right. So some freedom the Iraqi people have had since we got involved there.
Yeah.
How many? 500,000 children were killed.
Yeah, freedom from the earthly bonds. I guess.
Yeah, that kind of freedom. Maybe if you to go to heaven, perhaps.
But so the title itself is ominous. If you look at it that way, the other point is that the president said, I'm signing this bill, but I'm not going to impose any of these sanctions. I just want to, basically, I want to have them in my back pocket. And this is also similar to the bill passed in 2002 that authorized the president to go to war with Iraq if he wanted to, if he felt like it.
Yeah.
You know, if you remember Dr. Paul at the time, one of his main complaints, aside from the moral complaint and the practical complaint that it was stupid to go to war with Iraq, was the idea that it was unconstitutional for Congress to skirt its responsibility to declare war and to sort of just give that authority to the president. Hey, if you want to go to war, fine with us. If you don't, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
So this is what this does. It says here is a ton of money. You know, this $350 million is only part of what the bill authorizes. Here's a ton of money. And an authorization is a technical term. It's a very important technical and legal term. It means that money is made available for the president. So he just kind of has it in a big bowl.
He can do with it what he wants.
Exactly. And it has other things like it has millions of dollars for the U.S. to increase its state-funded propaganda broadcasts into the former Soviet Union. You know, and this at the same time that the U.S. criticizes Russia for having RT and other stations,
right,
while it does the exact same thing. So it's millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars available for the president to use for regime change and to prop up Ukraine, and this authorization for sanctions whenever he feels like it. So it's a very dangerous precedent. And back to your question, is it leading us more closely to war? I think with this kind of escalation that the U.S. continues, how long before there isn't some sort of more substantive Russian response? You know, it's not that I hope that happens, but what country would sit idly by where, you know, the U.S. has already stationed how many tanks, fighters, troops on Russian borders? Even all the time it's saying that Russia is the aggressor. Well, we're putting and I think Putin said in his press conference this last week, it's not Russia that's putting its troops on the U.S. border, it's the other way around.
Right.
So I think it is getting dangerous. I think the U.S. doesn't see any consequences to its actions thus far, so it just, like a recalcitrant child, it keeps pushing up the volume until something happens.
Yeah, it definitely seems that way, and there also seems to be an illusion among a lot of the intellectuals here that somehow these sanctions are working, that they are putting Putin into a bad state in the Russian economy. I think there's no doubt about that. Putin himself acknowledges that. The oil prices, which may probably have also been orchestrated to a certain extent with our unholy ally Saudi Arabia, pushing oil prices lower, also to try to hurt Putin and the Russian economy, to try to bring him to his knees. But, you know, Putin announced when we started sanctions that this would boomerang back and hurt us and hurt the United States economy. Now we're seeing the oil price drop dramatically, and there's an awful lot of companies, especially sort of marginal producers of oil and gas, that have gone out and borrowed a lot of money thanks to the zero interest rate policies of of our Janet Yellen now, the Federal Reserve, and now they're having a hard time with the $50, $60 oil to pay it back. And so the financial markets have been roiled to a certain extent as a result of this. And the equity markets have come under a lot of pressure. Jawboning have brought them back. But, you know, I'm not so sure people that watch what Putin's doing with a more balanced view and desire to see what the truth is are suggesting that Mr. Putin's financial condition isn't bad at all. As a matter of fact, there was this Council of Foreign Relations guy, Bremer, who himself was saying yesterday, I think it was on Charlie Rose, in which he was saying, don't fool yourself. Putin can stand up against this pressure for a long time. He's got lots of reserves, and he didn't mention gold, but my sources are suggesting that Putin is building up a huge amount of gold. He imported a large amount of gold last month. He has a balance of trade surplus, unlike the United States, which has constantly running a deficit. He doesn't have the debt behind on the balance sheet of his central bank like we have. And so it's all sort of a big con game, I think, to a great extent, Daniel. And, you know, we want to bring Putin to his knees, and I can't help but think that the other big news of this week that had to do with President Obama announcing that the U.S. will restore full relations with Cuba might not really be a slap in the face of Vladimir Putin, another way to try to get back at him, maybe in retaliation for what he's done in the Crimea, the Ukraine, or Syria. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. It's some people have certainly questioned the timing. Why now all of a sudden is President Obama saying we want to be good buddies with Cuba? Neither of the Castro brothers are dead that we know of. We know that he's been on the phone with Raul Castro, and I don't want to be sour grapes on what could be a very good development in foreign policy. The only good development, as far as I can see, in the Obama presidency, aside from at least beginning the talks with Iran. However, I think you do make a point, and I wonder how much of this is directed toward Russia, which, as you know, President Putin was in Cuba not long ago, and they signed some significant trade deals, and Russia was definitely increasing its presence and its activity in Cuba. So I think it would be naive to completely discount the notion that there's some sort of a geopolitical concern to this development.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you think it might mean for our relations with Cuba going forward? I'm hearing, on the business channels like Bloomberg or CNBC talk about how U.S. companies, automobile manufacturers, and other companies are sort of licking their chops at the potential of a market of, I don't know, 15 million people or whatever it is. So it's a pretty good sized chunk of purchases that could come through from there. But what do you think it might mean for the United States and Cuba's relations going forward?
Well, I think there's the moral and practical issue, which Dr. Paula commented on this past week as well, which is that it's anti-American for the U.S. government to tell us that we cannot visit a certain country, just because the U.S. government doesn't like their government.
Yeah.
So there's a moral issue that it's an anti-American policy to prevent us from going and spending our money in Cuba as we wish. So I think that is certainly a good part of it. I don't think it's an enormous market, and it's not a market of these people aren't making Swiss level salaries. So it's not like they're going to all rush off and buy iPads or something tomorrow. But the U.S. has a long relationship with Cuba. It's fairly checkered in many ways, but it does make sense from a moral and practical standpoint to open up the country. But the question is, and goes back to our previous question. It's interesting. Back in July, when Putin was there, the Cubans and Russians announced that Russia would be reopening an intelligence base that it had there during the Soviet times. So I wonder how things like this might be affected by the change in relations with the U.S. Maybe the U.S. is seeing all of these things adding up and saying, "Hey, it's not worth it." Yeah,
let's get in there where we can stop this or have some influence on the decision making in Cuba.
And let's kill them with kindness. I think there's, I've never had any illusions about the Cuban leadership. I'm certainly not a pro-Cuba guy. I'm anti-sanctions, but I do know from my many years of study of the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe that what happened when the elites, when the nomenclatura saw the writing on the wall, that their days of privilege were over, the biggest communists became the biggest capitalists overnight.
Yep.
And they went from wearing polyester suits to wearing very finely tailored wool suits.
Yes, that may be what's about to happen. That could be the underlying reason for Cuba deciding to.
I'm sure there are plenty of people there who would love to embrace all the glories of Western consumer products as long as they can keep their positions of power. Yeah. So I think there's certainly the idea that they would stand on principle, on communist principle, I think is not very well supported by historical fact.
Yeah, unfortunately, they like they like the prosperity of the West, which unfortunately the West itself doesn't understand came as a result of a pretty strong policy of free market capitalism. And as we're getting rid of free market capitalism, the West itself is running into big trouble. So
yeah, these days it comes by credit card.
It comes by credit card, and it's not real savings, and it's a mess, Daniel. It's a mess because we've gone away from the basic fundamentals of sound money. But that's another topic, of course, that your boss Ron Paul talks about all the time, and we're very grateful to him because he's really done a great job of educating people. But it's all connected, the economics and foreign policy and what's happening. That's why I really like to have you come on and talk to our listeners about the down in the weeds stuff that's going on that helps us understand what's really going on behind the scenes and what some of the motives are and how it does connect to this dishonest money. Really does.
Absolutely.
It's without dishonest money, so much of this other evil stuff could not have ever happened. But I want to get to one headline that I just saw before you and I started talking, and it has to do with France's leader, Holland. He's breaking ranks, according to a story in the Washington Post. The headline is Holland breaks EU ranks on Russia, floats sanctions relief, and the article is saying that. Just a quote from Holland: "If gestures are sent by Russia as we expect, there would be no reason to impose new sanctions, but on the contrary, to look at how we could bring about a de-escalation from our side." End of quote. So that was from Holland, the leader in France. Wishful thinking, Daniel?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it may well be true. We do know that the sanctions have hit the EU economy. Most notably Germany. Every time I look, I see something new. Yesterday I saw something about how exports of German cars have absolutely gone through the basement to Russia, and so it certainly does hurt European industry. They thought it was going to be a quick and painless maneuver to get Putin to his knees, as you said earlier, but it's turned out to not be that. So. In theory, I could certainly see how some of these leaders are looking for relief, especially someone as unpopular as François Hollande, whose numbers are absolutely in the basement along with his trade to Russia. However, I've seen these kinds of stories before. Every other day I see that Merkel's changing her mind and she's going to relinquish on sanctions, and then you see a quote from her the next day saying we need to double down. So I'd like to see some action and not just this kind of reporting. To really start thinking things that they're coming to their senses and realizing that the best way for peace and prosperity is to have trade and good relations.
Yeah, well, as Jeff Dice has said, the pictures that are painted, it's not necessarily reality, but perception is reality in politics. So. Unfortunately, I hope that's not the case. I would really like to see some of these countries standing up for their own sovereignty and their own rights and their own citizens down, at the grassroots, rather than letting NATO dictate what these countries do to their citizens, and literally do to their citizens. So it's we can always hope, Daniel, but like you say, you'd like to see some verification, not just trust. But anything else you'd like to add this week?
No, I think we've covered it. I think Cuba. I think the Russian sanctions bill is big. We see that the FBI has decided finally that North Korea is indeed responsible for hacking the Sony computers and causing this horrific U.S. film. I haven't seen it, but it sounds horrific. The U.S. makes a comedy film about assassinating a foreign leader. Doesn't that show how far we've sunk on a moral level?
Yeah.
That this is somehow what's funny.
Yeah.
It's a computer game.
Right.
But there have been there's a story in Wired and elsewhere that says the U.S. evidence that North Korea is behind this is pretty flimsy indeed. So I'm very skeptical about any U.S. claim. We heard what they said about the airliner crash over Ukraine
without any evidence.
Without any evidence. So, unfortunately, it's the government that cries wolf, and I think many Americans, at least those that aren't addicted to the mainstream media, those that are looking outside the matrix, every time the government says something. And I'm hearing Lou Rockwell's voice in my mind. When the government says one thing, you have to believe the opposite, I think. So.
Unfortunately, it's all too often the case, isn't it, Daniel? But perception is reality, as they say, and as long as they can get people thinking one thing, then they've got control of them, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So that's the problem. Well, thanks again, Daniel, for shedding some light on what is truthfully going on geopolitically. We do appreciate it very much. In observation of Christmas, we will not do an interview next week. I guess Daniel will give a week off. I'm going to be traveling to Ohio with my family to be with my mother and my brothers and all that, and I'm sure you'll be with your family as well. So, but I do look forward to talking to you again on January 2nd, if you're available, Friday of January 2nd, to do a week in review then, if you're available.
Thank you, Jay.
Look forward to doing that. Well, that's it for this week, folks. Have a Merry Christmas. Until January 2nd, goodbye and God's blessings to you.